This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 389, Headless, Fact or Fiction. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about Headless and if it's really all it's cracked up to be with Martin Anderson-Clutz. Martin is an Acquia triple certified Drupal expert, in addition to certifications for usability and a variety of other web technologies. He lives in London, Ontario, Canada, and works at Acquia as a senior solutions engineer. Martin, as always, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks. Always a treat to be here.
For those of you that don't know, I'm John Picozzi, Solutions Architect at EPAM, and today my co-hosts are joining us for the second week, Jacob Rockowitz, module maintainer at the Big Blue House. Jacob, how are you?
I'm okay. Thanks for having me back again. Looking forward to this discussion, something I've definitely talked about in my own blog occasionally. It's great to be back.
Yes, and Jacob is the maintainer of the web form module and now the schema.org blueprints module. So check those out in your spare time. Joining us as usual, Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development. Nick, how are you?
Doing great. Looking forward to hearing more about Headless and see where this discussion takes us.
Fabulous. Before we dive into our primary topic, we have some words from our friends at Nerd Summit. Jen, tell us all about Nerd Summit.
Hi, my name is Jen. Are you a nerd? Yep, me too. And I want to make sure you know about Nerd Summit, an inclusive community building 3-day tech conference being held March 17th through 19th, 2023 at UMass Amherst in Amherst, Massachusetts. I work in software development, but I'm actually not a developer. And what I love about Nerd Summit is the wide variety of professions and experience levels that are represented. Nerd Summit's Friday and Saturday sessions will cover a wide variety of topics, including accessibility, leadership and career goals, tech tools, Drupal, development best practices, and much more. Our Friday keynote is the art of live coding, and Saturday's keynote is creativity under constraint and utilizes real-life Legos. There's also a Friday evening party, and Sunday is dedicated to even more training sessions. Tickets are just $50 and include breakfast and lunch Friday and Saturday. Reduced price and free tickets are also available. Visit nerdsummit.org to get your tickets and to sign up for our Slack and newsletter. Sponsorship opportunities are also still available for this year's conference. Check it out, Nerd Summit, nerdsummit.org, and see you there.
Thanks, Jen. Appreciate that. And actually, you know what? Interestingly enough, myself, Nick, and Steven will be at Nerd Summit this year. So if you are a listener and you are heading up to Western Mass for Nerd Summit, be sure to say hi. We would love to chat.
Yeah, I may as well. I'm going to be not at Nerd Summit because New Jersey camp, which is closer to me, is happening the same weekend in Princeton. So if you're closer to that camp, that's a great camp to go to.
There you go. You
nice
can
all these activities, yeah.
Everybody's getting back out again, so you can divide and conquer. You can say hi to Jacob in New Jersey or Nick, Steven, and myself in Western Mass. All right. Before we jump into our primary topic, Martin, can you tell us about our module of the week?
Thanks, John. I thought this week we would talk about the JSON API Search API module, which allows your headless Drupal site to also provide a search service. So it's a module that was created in November of 2019, and the current version is 8.x-1.0- release candidate 3, which came out in January, so just over a month ago, and that release added Drupal 10 readiness. It has 25 open bugs, 25 open issues, 12 of which are bugs, and is currently in use by just over 700 sites. Now, it's a module that is supported by Centauro, and the current maintainer, Jay Saksic, works for them. But the module was originally created by Matt Glayman, who has been a host on this show a number of times already. So in terms of the way JSON API, Search API works, it really provides or exposes, I guess you would say, the Search API as kind of a JSON API endpoint. So instead of using kind of a dedicated service like Algolia, like many headless websites will do, it allows you to use a custom route that can be used for sort of full text and filter queries, so that you can really create sort of, the standard result or search results experience that you would be used to with sort of a more traditional or unified architecture in a Drupal website. Because it leverages Search API, you can use it with either like your local database, a Solr or Elastic search core, and really anything that Search API has a connector for. It also does have support for facets, and it's probably also worth mentioning that an alternative module you could look at is something called Solrest, which more or less uses Drupal as kind of a pass-through directly to Solr to send queries, but obviously that solution is more specific to Solr itself. So anyone have any thoughts about JSON API, Search API?
I've not used it. Yeah, I've not used it myself, but I mean, Search API is definitely one of the cornerstones of complex Drupal sites. So having the ability to kind of use that with whatever backend, Elasticsearch or Solr or whatever, and kind of interact with this on the front end is super powerful, I think.
I could take a slightly different approach because, like, you bring up Algolia, and I'm using Conveo, which is another search provider, and something that more modern search providers or services are doing is APIs. And so this is proxying through to, if you had an Algolia backend conceptually, and by the way, I think for example, the Search API Algolia module has no front end. All it's there for is indexing data. And then the assumption is you're going to call their APIs directly. And in both Conveo and Algolia, from my experience, you'd benefit more calling them directly. You don't do the hop through, you get their full documentation, you get all their features. You might even get a slight performance gain because you're not proxying the request through Drupal. And the example would be they have load balance, like Algolia and Conveo have crazy load balance servers that are more performant than most Drupal sites. Sorry to say that, but they're probably more performant than
I've used Algolia on a front end, actually on a Drupal front end, and like it was lightning fast, and the API was really great to use. So I think like if you're using Algolia, like I happen to be an Algolia fanboy, so I mean, like I'm a little bit partial, but I think where like this module kind of fits in is where you have Solr on your backend and you're building a headless site, right? So there are a lot of people that are doing that. Their hosting provider is providing them with Solr. It's built in, quote unquote, built in, right? This makes that connection a lot easier, and it essentially allows you to be able to index the site and use it similarly to Algolia as far as like, hey, we're going to have components on the front end pulling that data and doing stuff with it. But
does Solr provide APIs, or that's where we're getting into this difference here? Like I assume it provides APIs, but not API. I mean, Algolia is like API first. I mean, their whole business is API.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, this would be like, hey, we indexed it. And then now like this module is providing APIs from Drupal to be able to use for the search front end. So like in that case, like we're removing like, with Algolia, like you get Algolia indexing and then organizing and providing the APIs and the functionality on top of that. So like, I think Algolia is replacing Solr in this use case.
Yeah. And one thing I will say that this module seems really good for is a lot of times people do overkill on search. Like you have a news page and you want to let people search news articles, and there's 1,000 news articles. The search is a keyword and that's it, or a facet. And this puts that layer in front that makes it a lot simpler. Like once you implement it, you don't have to think about your backend anymore. You could just literally change from one index to another. And I've worked at organizations that change their search index every few years. It happens outside of Drupal upgrades. It's just politics or,
right.
Try this, try that.
this also removes a little bit of a barrier too, I think, right? So like if you're thinking of moving from like a monolithic coupled solution to a headless solution, right? One of the factors you may be considering there is like, oh, we have we're using solar and we have it tuned and configured exactly how we need it to. Like, how do we translate that to our headless front end? And this kind of helps remove that barrier, right? Because you can still index, have solar index the way that it needs to, or Elasticsearch or whatever, whatever the search service is, and then still be able to provide this through API. Because I mean, that's the key here, right? Is like, hey, like that data needs to be available through an API. And like, we've already kind of harped on the fact that Algolia provides that out of the box, but like, if you didn't have the ability to, move to a service like Algolia, or didn't want to, because, you've spent the time, you've invested in solar, right? This is, I feel like this is probably making that jump a little bit easier for folks.
I think the other thing maybe worth mentioning too is there's also added flexibility here, because Search API has such a rich ecosystem of modules there as well that, there's lots of, community provided modules, a couple of which we've actually talked about as module of the week already, that can be dropped into sort of, give some more nuances in terms of how those search results are returned.
That actually raises another question for me, Martin. Is this JSON API integration work with like, one of the things that I do fairly often with Search API when I'm exposing that to clients or to end users rather, is create a view that searches a specific index or a specific facet. Does it work off of those as well? Like if you create a view, does it give an endpoint for that view to hit on a particular page? Or are you doing all that logic on the front end? Like if you want a particular search field to search just newsletters, like Jacob said, or news articles, are you doing that all on the front end with just kind of like facets, or are you able to build that in Drupal and just request an endpoint?
So my understanding is that it has facet support, but I don't know that it really is specific to a view in the same way that a traditional architecture would be. So it sounds like in that kind of a use case, you would probably have to do a little bit more of the work on your own in terms of how you get that query built.
Yeah, the README has the most documentation, and it's all index based. It's basically taking the index entity, the Search API index entity, and exposing it through the JSON API. And then just allowing filters. And I think that makes sense. It's like keeping the scope of this module very focused. And views, you can expose views to APIs. I don't necessarily think it's JSON API compatible, but you can just take a view and just add like a JSON endpoint to return data sets.
Yep. Which is probably how people were doing it before, but this gives more flexibility. Awesome.
All right. Well, as always, Martin, thank you. And now on to our primary topic, which Martin is staying to join us for, as he is our expert. So Martin, we're really putting the show on Martin's back here. So we are talking about headless fact or fiction, and this topic is actually based on a blog post that Martin wrote a couple of weeks ago. So I was wondering, Martin, if you could start off by kind of giving us an overview of what the blog post was about and what we're kind of going to talk about today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say the inspiration for the blog post really came out of a number of conversations I was having. So as part of the Acquia pre-sales team, I talked to lots of different folks who are either, already bought into Drupal and looking for the best place to host it, or potentially, looking at changing their CMS and trying to decide between Drupal and competing technologies. And so have had a number of conversations where people have basically said from the outset that it's going to be headless, which is definitely fine. Drupal has great support for headless, but one of the, foundational books in sort of the pre-sales field is called Start With Why, right? So you really understand what's the reasoning behind certain decisions, particularly if, from a technology standpoint, some of those things have already been decided. Understanding the motivation that drove that decision is going to make for a better conversation in terms of, how you can meet their needs. And one of the justifications that I had heard from people again and again in terms of why they wanted to go headless was because they were certain that their site would be faster if it was on a headless architecture. And I've definitely, seen compelling demonstrations of headless sites that are lightning fast. But at the same time, I also know that, traditional or coupled, or as I like to say, unified Drupal sites can also be very fast and have built sites that are even hosted on relatively modest hardware where people have said, what's the secret sauce there? Because it seems like that site loads almost instantly. So I decided to sort of, from more of a technical level, try and unpack that a little bit in terms of seeing, those claims around headless sites being faster, is there any evidence to sort of, prove or disprove that? And also, if there is even an advantage to headless sites from a performance standpoint, how much of a potential benefit are we talking about? And so one of the things that I looked at is using the Core Web Vitals. So there was an episode of this show a few episodes back where we talked about Core Web Vitals and why that's important. But one of the key considerations that informs that is really around performance. And Google has really great reporting around Core Web Vitals. You can just go in, put in Drupal. You can compare it to things like Contentful or Content Stack, or you can also compare it to things like, Next.js and Gatsby. And actually, Drupal performs pretty favorably to all of those. And so, given that all of those technologies are really specific to headless, and Drupal, according to Google's reporting, performs better than they do, I think the main argument that I was trying to make by showing that is really just that having a headless site doesn't guarantee that it'll be faster. You can definitely build fast sites using headless technologies, and there are lots of great examples of those around, but there are also some examples of headless sites that are not fast, and probably for a lot of the same reasons why some Drupal sites end up not being fast. So, from a technology standpoint, I was just trying to sort of probe that idea of is one approach inherently more likely to give you a fast site than the other?
I was curious, what version, do you know what version of Drupal that these statistics were based on? I mean, were they Drupal 7, Drupal 9, or just Drupal period?
I would assume that they're just a blend of whatever version of Drupal sites on the internet are running. I mean, one of the things that, to be honest, occurred to me as I was thinking about that reporting is that I would think a lot of headless sites that are using Contentful or Content Stack as a backend CMS are probably statically rendered, at which point I'm not sure if Google would even be able to tell that. And so the fact that those show up in there may indicate that those are sites that are more doing like client-side rendering, which is inherently less likely to be as fast as if it was like statically generated. So the fact that those even show up may also be a bit of an indication of the approach taken on those. But again, I think that underscores the point that even in a headless world, sort of the skill and expertise of the team doing the implementation really does matter.
So you talked a little bit about the motivation already, but what specifically motivated you to actually write an article about it and look at the numbers, so to speak?
So I think when I started, I wasn't necessarily writing an article. I was just sort of collecting some thoughts that had been bouncing around in my head as I was having some of these different conversations. And then as I started to find some things like the Core Web Vitals reporting that seemed like it lined up, and sort of structure these things out in a fairly, I don't know, linear, but to tell a story in a way. I actually shared it with a few folks that I know, and it seemed like there was some good response. It seemed like people thought it was worth sharing in the community. To be honest, I was a little worried at first that it might be a bit of a third rail, because I know there's so much excitement around headless, and I didn't necessarily want to deflate any of that excitement, but just to make sure that it's kind of an honest conversation. We're using these technologies where they're the most appropriate and for the right reasons.
Interesting.
So I think the question now we have to start asking is where do you think headless makes sense? Like, there are use cases where people are using it, and we can assume that they've actually done their due diligence to make that decision.
Yeah, great question. So I think certainly a very comprehensive take on that question is a resource you can find in, I think it was a Dries blog post from 2019, where he really has sort of a conceptual model in terms of how to work through that decision of whether a headless approach is appropriate, and also, on the spectrum of choices around decoupling Drupal, which is the most appropriate one. So, anything from, a fully coupled site where it's Drupal as both the front and back end, a fully decoupled or approach where Drupal is sort of dynamically serving out content through APIs, having statically generated as one of the points in that continuum, and also progressively decoupled, which is really something closer to a coupled Drupal site, but having headless components within it. So lots of different approaches there, and providing some thought points in terms of how to decide which of the approaches, again, within that sort of overall continuum, is going to be the most appropriate for any project. So I thought that was a really good resource, and there will be a link in the show notes for anyone who wants to sort of go back and read that. But for the sake of the conversation today, we could talk about maybe some use cases where I think a headless approach is going to be a really good fit. So, anytime a site needs to show real-time information, so you can think like live sports scores, or I know there are sort of, mass transit systems that use Drupal and have kind of those headless APIs as a way of sharing those things out in a way that makes it very performant. Those are definitely excellent use cases. Anything that has to have a very dynamic or application-like experience is definitely going to be a good fit for some form of headless. But again, even something like the progressively decoupled or hybrid architecture sometimes can achieve some of those. Another really good use case for headless sometimes is if you need to have kind of one CMS that's going to manage content across a variety of different front-end sites. So you can definitely do that with things like multi-site paired with, let's say, context, or I think there's a module called domain that can do some of these kinds of things. But headless is actually a pretty good fit for those kinds of applications as well. I do think that having good front-end expertise is also part of that consideration. So if your team is really more sort of, marketers with a little bit of site building understanding, then pushing them into the headless pool is a bit of a shove into the deep end and hoping that they can muddle their way through in some cases, particularly things around the content architecture and being able to adapt that over time. Another big advantage of going headless is if the organization doing the implementation has kind of front end and back end teams that are really dedicated, then there's, I would say, typically a lower level of coordination that needs to happen between those teams. They can sort of agree on, how the APIs need to be structured, and then each kind of go off and do their own work independently. So that's definitely a strength of the headless approach. And then also, I think if you've got or an organization that has a website where they know they're going to constantly be sort of evolving that front end, they want to be a little bit more bleeding edge in terms of, overhauling it every 6 months to take advantage of everything that's sort of new and the most exciting. Having that decoupled approach means that, they have to do the minimal amount of work to the back end to accommodate front end changes that they know they're going to be making on a more aggressive basis.
Yeah, I think it also depends which flavor of headless you're going to, right? Because they're static. Then there's also things like React or Vue.js where they're headless, but they're still a lot more interactive than just kind of a static site generator type thing. But yeah, I think that last one is one is a good use case that people sometimes forget about. If you're going to be if you don't want to migrate your data every time you want to change the front end, then having a strong API in the back end that you just have to integrate with allows you to change that. And I think another one too is that sometimes is under considered. I don't know if that's the way to put it. Is
underappreciated, maybe?
Underappreciated is security. I think sometimes it's easier to make a headless site more secure because you can lock down kind of the Drupal side of things a little bit more. Since you're just interacting with it on the API side, but that's not to say that front end architectures and frameworks don't have their own security concerns. But especially if you're on the static side. It's a lot easier to make that secure.
It's interesting. Josh Koenig from Pantheon, co-founder and chief strategy officer at Pantheon, has been posting kind of some blog posts about Headless, and one of them is escaping the website relaunch. And I think you just kind of touched on that a little bit as far as Headless possibly being a solution to kind of escape that relaunch, replatform kind of cycle where and I think overall, like for the web, this is probably a whole nother show topic, but I think overall for the web, like we're moving away from that. Like every 3 years I have to relaunch my website, where in reality, now that Drupal has a stable upgrade path, like it's more like every 3 years, like I just really need to like repaint my website with different colors and maybe make some architectural improvements because we found that things are not working right.
Well, also just evolving it. It's like I would say it's not every 3 years you redo your websites. Every year you're evolving different sections of your web, especially on the enterprise giant websites where they got 100,000 pages. You just can't redo it. You can't. It becomes impossible. So you're taking piece by piece. You're like, we need to improve our search. We'll going back to our module of the week. You improve that, and that progressive decoupling really makes that possible, because you can gradually decouple pieces and gains that are very targeted.
I agree with that 100%. I'm working on a kind of a platform that's going to support a bunch of a Drupal based platform. It's also headless. That's going to support, up to 100 sites when it's all said and done. And like the vision I have for that is that it evolves, and you produce better features, improve features, but you don't ever really have to like upgrade or do like, we're not going back to the days of like a 6 to 8 Drupal migration, right? Where you're like, oh, it's a brand new site, we're going to rebuild the whole thing. Like you're just systematically improving it.
One other place where it kind of makes sense too, that I apologize, I didn't hear you touch on, Martin, but maybe you did. That is when you're pulling information from multiple pools. I mean, it kind of goes back to our episode last week with Valhalla, right? That's one way to do it too. But if your front end is pulling from Drupal, multiple Drupal sites, and maybe Contentful or something for the blog, and a bunch of other things, Headless really makes sense there. Now Drupal can integrate with those things, and I've done that, but a lot of bigger organizations will use one tool for one job and use like a headless architecture to kind of pull everything together themselves.
So
I think e-commerce is very common in that use case. You see more and more, using Drupal as sort of the place where the marketing information around products is sort of stored and managed by the marketing team, but then everything transactional ties into the commerce backend that is tied into like an ERP system, and those are really brought together in some flavor of Headless. So whether it's a Drupal unified site with decoupled components for the different commerce elements, or some flavor of that Headless integration for sure.
It's interesting because Martin and I were both at Florida Drupal Camp a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about this topic because my talk at Florida Drupal Camp was about headless and how you can build an omni-channel web platform using Drupal and headless technologies, and we both came to the conclusion, and I'll let Martin speak for himself, but I think we both came to the conclusion that like it's very situational, right? You have to know what all the moving parts are and whether it makes sense or it doesn't make sense to go down this path. One question I have, we kind of talked about what kicked off this whole thought train for you, and I think you're very you're very accurate in the fact that like you can build a headless site poorly that doesn't perform well. You can build a Drupal site poorly that doesn't perform well. You can go in the opposite direction, right? You can build a headless site that performs very well. You can build a Drupal coupled site that performs very well, right? It's very much about how it's built, what's happening under the hood. And we've seen it. We've seen Drupal, coupled Drupal sites be very performant and very fast with caching and all that stuff. I'm wondering if it's possible, can you, apples to apples, coupled Drupal site to headless site, right? which one performs better? Like if all things are equal, right? Caching, structure, everything. Can you get a Drupal site to perform as well as a headless site, or can you get a Drupal site to perform better than a headless site? In again, all things created equal.
I'm tempted to dodge that question by saying I don't think it'll ever be entirely apples to apples. I've definitely seen lots of Drupal sites that are very fast. And I have definitely seen some examples of headless sites that are very slow, and don't want to name names at this time. But
we appreciate that.
Well, I would say in general, I think a lot of the headless frameworks. So if you look at like a Gatsby or Next.js, I think out of the box they do some sophisticated things that for a Drupal team would require a little bit of implementation. So you think about like converting things to WebP. Setting up your image styles. There are a number of things that I think maybe some of the headless frameworks are potentially a bit more opinionated in terms of some of the things that they do out of the box. I do still think it's possible to over-rely on the amount of JavaScript frameworks or libraries that are being pulled in and some of those things. And I think that's where you see a lot of the headless sites sort of start to creep into an area where they're getting dinged for things like Core Web Vitals is either the amount of JavaScript being loaded or even just the sort of execution time of running that when the page actually loads. So,
right. Yeah. Do you think you see in a coupled solution, right? Do you think you see increased load times specifically around like the loading of other entities? Like if you were to do like what we've been talking about search quite a bit, right? Or e-commerce, right? Where you have a page that's kind of loading other entities. Like, is that typically where you think you see like a decrease in performance on the Drupal side, as where like it's a lot, I won't say easier, but it's perceivably faster to load that on a headless solution?
So I do think that, again, talking about what some of these headless frameworks will do out of the box, they'll do things like prefetching, which on the Drupal side, you could use like the quick link module to potentially do some of the same kinds of things.
Right.
But even in terms of some of those more dynamic layers and sort of having to load nested entities and some of those other things, Drupal actually, as an infrastructure, or, like if you think about any of the major hosting platforms for Drupal, they've all got all kinds of multiple layers of caching built in. So, it's either like, Memcached or Redis, probably Varnish, some form of CDN. So a bunch of different pieces where it's only a very narrow use case where a user is typically going to really encounter the full latency of, building out everything from sort of a raw database cache. Most users are actually going to get something that's cached, even at the CDN level, where their experience of that is going to be relatively the same as if that was, serving a static rendered file in the same way.
Yeah, I want to echo that. I think you got to step back and just be like, what's the strategy for a website? It's caching. It's serving users the information they need and only what they need. And that's key to performance. And then you brought up this execution, which is a really I think that's the nuance that people run into, is execution, like the perceived user experience when you're doing a search or you're navigating, you're sliding through a carousel. And one thing I will say, what I like about progressive decoupling is this notion that, or even React being component driven, you can get into a component and give someone a user experience in that component that's exactly what they're looking for. And that perceived performance is much greater because you're not reloading every page. Like if they're just paging through content and it's faster, it feels faster. And sometimes you could struggle to bring that into Drupal. Even the fact that like React and Next has like preloading, prefetching, all the little nuances built in that create a better, I would like to say, perceived user experience, like from the user's perspective.
And perception is reality, right? On some level. So I think one of the things too that people forget about a lot of these decoupled solutions, especially React, in my experience, is generally the way that developers a lot of times, and this is a blanket statement, not meant to be a blanket statement, but it I'm going to say it. A lot
I feel
of
like we
times
should have danger sirens that go off whenever we say.
A site's
Go ahead,
only as
Nick.
good as its developers.
Well, no. So what I was going to say is a lot of the times with React, they really only worry about that second interaction, right? That first interaction is going to take forever because you're downloading 25 megabytes of JavaScript to get the React on the page, but then then it's downloading 20 megabytes of prefetched data and stuff. But once that's done, well, everything is lightning fast because it doesn't have to go back to the server, right? And I'm generalizing a lot and I'm being hyperbolic, but
as per the usual, though, I don't necessarily agree with that. But I'll let you finish your point.
Yeah, but I think that's something that's different between a PHP application versus a JavaScript framework, right? Many times the perceived performance is faster just after you've already loaded a lot of the stuff. Once you've done that, things are very quick. And then on a PHP application, you're loading it when you're going to a new page. There's prefetching and stuff. But if you go to a completely random link or something, then it's going to have to load that and you're going to have to wait. Whereas you don't get that flash with React or Angular or whatever.
All right, you kind of straightened it out. I guess I can agree with that statement now. I was basically going to say that I think everybody from a client standpoint, right? Like developer aside, like if a page, you have two pages side by side and the React one takes 30 seconds to load and the Drupal native one takes 5 seconds to load, the client's going to be like, well, why does this one load so much faster than that one? Right. So I think you have to figure that problem out. So I don't know that it's necessarily developers developing things as much as it's like, that perceived, speed. Right. But I mean, I guess based on what you said, right, if you have the ability to kind of say like, hey, we're going to load the first bits of content on the React side in 5 seconds and the first bits of Drupal content in 5 seconds and then background load both of those, right? Yeah. It kind of negates that, right?
And I just want to call out before I get the angry. Oh, actually, I've never gotten angry letters from our listeners, but before the response,
now.
I do know that React, you can load just what you need on the first page. You can do some server-side rendering and stuff. Out of the box, though, a lot of times people just, especially for more straightforward integrations, they just load React and then just let it handle all this stuff as you go through the site. But
we got to step back, and I just want to throw out there, I would never suggest it. Okay, so Drupal's for enterprise. I'm going to make that broad statement. And in the same way I wouldn't tell someone to start building a site using PHP, I wouldn't necessarily say you start from React. You start from Next.js or Gatsby. Yeah. And Next.js is like investing huge in fixing that performance issue. It's crazy what they're doing. Like I'm trying to look up the name, but basically they're rewriting Webpack to be like 15 times faster with better compression, so that they're mitigating all that user experience issue, that latency, and the SEO thing, which we haven't even talked about because it doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
But you have to be using a framework. If you were just like, I'm creating a React app, you're going to get all these past hits that people talked about. But if you use Next.js or Gatsby, they're solving these really, really complex problems. And I hate to say it, but they're solving it at a much larger scale than Drupal ever could, because lots of different people are using Next.js, a lot more than Drupal. So they're taking into account, they're solving it in the millions of the tens of millions of websites. And Drupal's, a few million websites out there. And JavaScript just has more developers. I mean, I just want to throw that out. There are more eyeballs looking at JavaScript these days.
So I mean, I think we're going to keep coming back to the same underlying theme here. For our listeners, right? It's not so much one is faster than the other. Like it very much, and somebody speak out if I'm off base here, but like it very much comes down to like the how it's built, right? And then the architectural decisions of whether it makes sense for you. And then I think Jacob just touched on something interesting there as well, right? Is like there's a lot of functionality coming from JS frameworks that's improving things, right? So making the experience better, but also team dynamic kind of factors into this. Like, I'm seeing quite a few clients that are coming and saying like, hey, we have React developers on our team. We don't have Drupal developers. Like, how are we gonna reconcile this? We want to be able to use our existing team, right? So, I think that the team composition is an aspect there too. I guess that's a long-winded way of saying, like, at the end of the day, fact or fiction really comes down to like the situation that you're trying to solve for, right?
Well, John, just step back. It's more than team development, because I've talked to some large agencies and they're just like, we want to do headless because it's easier to recruit JavaScript developers. Sure. I've heard people go so far to say that they see a team having a breakdown of a team of 10 front-end JavaScript developers and 3 back-end Drupal developers. And I think we just have to recognize Drupal's not that interesting. It's PHP. It's old. It works.
I think it's
okay. I'm just, I'm like, and it's hard to say that, but it's like Drupal's shifting into becoming this very stable backend. I mean, if I was going to make my generalization about it, where we are trying to build something that's like a future-proof backend. Once it's in your infrastructure, it does what it does really well, and it doesn't break. Yeah, it's and I mean, I'll rant for a second and say
I'll knock on wood for that one.
Well, and I'll rant and say I think Drupal's for content. Like I might write a blog post and that's the title of it, because that, if we own that, then we're like, so it serves content, and then everything else is nice things around it, and and your front end people can do amazing, incredible things if we give them great content.
I agree with all of those points. And one of the points I make in the talk that I delivered at Florida Drupal Camp is that, like, I consider Drupal like the glue or a traffic cop for a lot of services and a lot of implementations, right? And it's really good at that. Like, hey, Drupal can integrate with everything. Drupal can send data or receive data from anywhere, right? Awesome. Like, that's definitely a great place for that. As far as the team thing goes, Jacob, I agree with you. I think, like, back when I was with in agency life, smaller agency life, like, and we were building coupled sites, like, our front end development time was so much more than our back end development time. It was ridiculous. Like, every project we're like, how can we decrease front end development time? And like, here comes JavaScript, like out of left field, like, oh, hey, if you use a framework, like, you can go back to building websites the way you used to and not have to use, Twig templates and do all of this other stuff. And not to say that that's bad or that's wrong. I think that there's a place for it, but like, it is a path to decreasing cost. Right. So I also wonder, and this is totally off topic, but I also wonder, like, at what point do we like go, oh, you know what? Like, let's ditch the Twig theming layer and let's just move to a Drupal JS framework for the front end, where like you just build the connections and people go and do what they want, how they want.
I think we're a ways away from that happening. Okay, so shifting gears a bit, the module of the week this week had API in the title twice. And a lot of times we talk about API. Drupal is great as an API hub, APIs are for headless. But one of the questions that we had is, are APIs important from a Drupal perspective, even if you aren't going headless?
I'd have to say absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that makes Drupal so flexible is really its rich set of APIs. I mean, oftentimes when I'm talking to developers who are maybe a bit skeptical about Drupal and its capabilities, even just showing the API documentation page that lists out such a rich set of APIs that allow Drupal to really be molded to some very specific use cases, I think is incredibly powerful, and also makes Drupal really flexible in terms of being kind of that omni-channel solution that can feed your content out to digital signage and mobile apps and lots of different applications. It's not sort of strictly just useful for web apps by any means.
Can I echo something? Really, I built a coupled site, and I didn't turn on the APIs. And then when I turned on the APIs, I had a mess because my field structure, the data structures were just not clean. And I strongly advocate, even if someone's not going headless, they have no one even needs the APIs, but they know somewhere down the line someone might want their data, meaning their website's on the web. That's as simple. Like that's an inevitable thing because Google wants your data. They're going to want at some point. Google's going to be like, "Do you have an API?" And I think turning on JSON API from day one, even if it's not publicly available, just to review as you build out content types and your data structures makes sense is huge. Because also the other mistake is you want to like I made the mistake with JSON API or any API. You only want to expose the data you think someone's going to need. So it's well structured and you never change it. And one of the problems, this is a core issue, is you turn on JSON API, it exposes everything. Yeah. And even by turning that on, you start thinking a little more about, well, what is our content? Because you don't actually, I would throw out there, I don't know if you need to expose image styles, or that's not something I would worry about immediately. Down the line, if you're going decoupled, you need image styles. But you do want to look at what's our blog post, what's our fields, are we using taxonomy? Does this make sense? And turning on API documentation. And I mean, I'll also, one other thing is that inevitably makes the point when you turn on API documentation for a content type, you're like, oh, kind of makes sense to have good field names and descriptions for everything. Like it just encourages people to think that way because they see they're reading what's the expected, the data structure. Yeah. I think it helps future-proof your site, even if you're not ready to decouple for 5 years from now. Your team's thinking about it.
And I think, like I said, right, I agree with Martin here. Like APIs are important, even if you're not going headless, right? Because, like as I said earlier, like Drupal playing the glue or the traffic cop in a scenario, like not only do you need APIs in, but in some cases you need APIs out. Like a lot of folks like to integrate with like Salesforce, for example. So like if you're taking data in, you want to be able to send that back out to Salesforce in some way, shape, or form. So, I definitely think the APIs are important.
So, Martin, it's, we're talking about headless APIs, but and we've mentioned progressive decoupling, but, how would you describe progressive decoupling works in the real world? And is it a good sound approach for someone to do, or are you one way to put it is if you have a couple site and you start progressively decoupling, are you adding layers of complexity? Be one thing that comes to mind.
So I would say a progressively decoupled Drupal site, the way I've seen it implemented the most often is really sort of having that unified architecture. Drupal is the front and back end, but then embedding within it some kind of headless components. So whether it's using something like the components module or some other strategy to basically make those available, could be as blocks or as paragraphs, whatever the sort of layout system is, giving content editors the ability to sort of use some of those elements that are either pulling data from Drupal through one of those APIs, or maybe even from a completely other data store. So an e-commerce framework, some other content platform, those kinds of things. Is that making it more complex? It typically would be making it more complex, but I think it potentially also gives you maybe some of the benefits of both approaches, right? So you get the ability to have more interactive elements where they're needed, but at the same time, you can still have some of the flexibility of using Drupal as the combined sort of, back end and front end. So I think there are still some advantages for particular use cases of having Drupal as both the front and back end. And so being able to sort of, pick and choose where you want it decoupled and where you don't is it can be beneficial for definitely some teams. The other form of progressive decoupling that has been talked about on this show is actually having sections of the site that are fully headless and some that are sort of fully unified. And so that's one that I've not seen as often, but is definitely an interesting approach. And it sounds like some of the organizations that have gone down that path have had some success with it.
Yeah, I actually, when we were talking about Algolia, that's where we actually progressively decoupled a Drupal site. Was like we had a few search functional features on a site, and those were all coming from Algolia directly on the front end, and it worked. I mean, it worked really well. We dropped those components into Drupal blocks and placed them where we needed to. So it worked really well in that regard. And I know Bounteous actually, I think, went through a progressive decoupling exercise, and they have a couple of blog posts about that as well.
one of the other advantages about it is it allows you to be a bit more agile about a project or an upgrade as well, or split it up over a few things. So, for example, if you have a really complex enterprise site that's been built up over years and years and years, rebuilding that whole thing from scratch, whether it's decoupled or not, might take 2, 3, 4 years. But if you progressively decouple it or progressively rebuild it, you can say, like, we're doing the blog now, right? We're doing the user management next. We're doing this next. We're doing the e-commerce next. And if you have a big enough team or multiple agencies, you can just say, like, hey, your responsibility is the blog and your responsibility is the cart, right? And you can allow different teams to work on it and have a common goal.
I have some experience that's slowly happening with this, and the challenge is relationships between content. It, like, that becomes this, like, you have these different pieces that move slightly differently, and I think it's solvable, but that's the big challenge when you start breaking the site into these pieces, and suddenly it moves to, it's going through, one part's going through Next.js, but you want it to have an entity reference to something on a page in Drupal, and you're tracking that. Or, I mean, even having two sites and sharing content between is a tricky thing. What's great is Drupal has so many solutions to these problems, like something that is, people don't even know this about the migrate module, but you can do Drupal to Drupal migrations. And I want to be clear, not Drupal 6 to 7 or to 8, but like you have a Drupal 10 site that's an old architecture and you're building a new architecture, and you can migrate content back and forth between them using the migrate module with ease. I mean, the data structures are so similar that's an easy migration. You're not doing a lot of custom data massaging, but you're able to restructure things and clean them up or convert data and convert your images to media. By the way, I have one of those sites. We didn't use media. It didn't exist. Now we have to use it. That's a huge lift. It's overwhelming to convert, tens of thousands of images to media and create a good user experience. So.
Absolutely.
So we talked about performance, right? And the performance gains, benefits, and how we can kind of neutralize that across. But Martin, I'm wondering, in your mind, where doesn't it make sense to use headless? Like, where would you say, like, headless is kind of a dumb solution in this regard?
So the analogy I think about sometimes is, gas-powered cars versus electric vehicles. So for a long time, electric vehicles were only small and they had limited range. And so it was very easy to say that it was like only a good solution for people who lived close to the city center and had to make short trips and, could afford to buy this more expensive vehicle and so on. And then, somebody had the idea to make an electric vehicle as sort of the high-end luxury vehicle, which sort of, changed the thinking around electric vehicles. And now we see them being more and more commonplace. And so it's a technology that those places where it doesn't make sense are becoming fewer and fewer. And I feel like headless is sort of the same kind of a thing. There were probably initially a lot of places where, you wouldn't want to use a headless site if the menu is going to change frequently, because it used to be that headless, to go headless meant that all of that was managed in a static file, and so you'd have to have a front-end dev update the menu file every time somebody wanted to add a page into the navigation structure, whereas a lot of that is becoming more dynamic. And so you start to see the same thing around translation. We talked about search earlier, and so I think that the footprint of places where headless doesn't make sense is getting smaller and smaller every day, and so it really becomes more around some of the other considerations that we've talked about. I think, based on my own experience of working with a headless site late last year, one of the things that I saw is updating the content architecture in a headless site definitely requires a level of programming in terms of, creating templates and some of those other things. Whereas in Drupal, you can create a content type and add different fields and switch between formatters and then use layout builders to sort of define how those things are going to be structured. And maybe it's not going to have the level of finesse as if you actually had a dedicated front end go in and make everything look clean and polished. But you can build that out pretty easily with just, sort of basic site level expertise. So I feel like if you've got a content architecture that needs to evolve, and maybe it's just a site builder going in who doesn't have a lot of, JavaScript or React experience, then that's maybe a good use case for just sticking with sort of a traditional Drupal architecture. But as I said, the number of those use cases, I think, grows shorter every day.
I was actually I was thinking that, right? Like where you have like that use case of like site builder heavy kind of interaction, right? You're gonna rely on your theme in Drupal quite a bit to kind of make sure things look right, look good, and allow them to kind of go in and create new content types and do those sorts of things. But yeah, that's not easily achievable, I think, in a headless architecture, especially where adding content types or components. I think like you can build systems where headless could support something like that, but it's got to be more of a design system, structured, component library.
Well, I'll also just say, like if we're talking about Drupal, it's like if you have a team of 3 developers and your government site, you have 3 developers. Let's go that scenario. Government site, you're allowed to use Drupal. You have 3 developers on your team. You should stay coupled to Drupal. If you have 3 developers, if you decouple, it gets so complex and hard to manage. It doesn't make sense. But then if you take that scenario outside, and I use government because I know governments can be restricted to Drupal. If you're a small organization, you have 3 developers and you're like, I want to build and I want to be as progressive as possible. You probably should go headless. I hate to say this on the Talking Drupal podcast. Don't use Drupal. If you don't use Drupal as your backend, go to a SaaS provider, or even Aqua has dabbled in that, of a CAS service where your backend is just your backend. You're not managing, configuring like Contentful. You get it, you turn it on, and the price can get ridiculous, but your goal is you want to meet your client's needs. So you want to get a stable backend and then have the front end go off and be as progressive as possible and keep evolving. And yeah, I see that even on small teams, you might be, especially a new, startup, you might want to start headless if you expect your organization to grow. Because also you could go with Contentful, use it, spend the money. It hits then you start hitting $250,000 a year and you're like, okay, I'm going to go to Drupal and move the back end over. And that's easy too. If you built your content architecture, not easy, but easier.
Yeah. We're getting to the same place. Like the new title of the show is going to be Headless. It depends.
Yeah.
We're coming towards the end of the show. I'm curious what you think, Martin. Do you think people have been putting too much faith in headless over the years, or do you think that headless is finally starting to grow into what people are trying to throw at it?
I mean, I think there are and have been for a while exciting aspects of the headless approach, and so I can definitely see why people would be excited to go that path. I do think there have been cases where people kind of put the tactic ahead of the strategy to some degree, in terms of sort of deciding that that's the route they wanted to go down because they were excited about it, without necessarily considering if a particular project was always a good fit. And there may be a degree of sort of, the saying of, when your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. I mean, I definitely have been guilty of that on the Drupal side, of just sort of wanting to build things in Drupal, because to me it's easy to spin up a Drupal site and solve certain things that it would take me longer to figure out, even though, some other solution for, an arbitrary team that didn't necessarily have significant expertise in one area or the other might find easier or better suited to that particular task. So to some degree, it's probably also who you're talking to and their understanding of how easy it is to adapt a certain technology to a set of problems. So that's probably a long-winded way of saying there probably have been cases where people have gone to headless, where at the time it was maybe still had some rough corners in terms of that being the technology to implement. But I think, as we've said, it gets better and better in terms of meeting a broader range of use cases every day.
I also want to point out one thing that I think there's an advantage to being an early adopter on some levels too, that we haven't mentioned, and that's, well, I think there's 2. One is publicity, right? Oh, yeah. Sometimes it's nice to be able to say, hey, we're one of the first organizations to use Gatsby, whether either as an agency or as the end client, right? The other thing is, if you adopt a technology early, you can build expertise in that, and you can, if it's especially if it's an open source technology, you can help influence how it matures and grows, right? If that's something that's important to you long term.
So, Nick, you avoided one that we haven't talked about. Maybe we have, but cost. I have seen some very large organizations that have these massive Drupal sites, like 150 Drupal sites, and they're paying for hosting for all the the Drupal's got a lot of infrastructure to serve pages, and they've gone headless, and they see the cost go down really fast. Like on that scale, the savings is huge. Not on small sites, 200 sites. And if they're literally reducing the cost by 50%, we're talking millions of dollars of savings. And simplicity. Like I've seen, and I won't name names, but it's like a pharmaceutical site where they also their sites are static. They just need the security of write the content, the drug comes out, hit publish, boom, site hosted for, a few $100s a month and not $10,000, a month or whatever price it is. And I've seen that gain a lot. Like on that scale, that's the argument I've seen when they go headless is cost.
Yeah, that's a great point, and especially if you go static with a lot of this stuff, where you have Drupal kind of in the back end, like you can have a much more underpowered Drupal site if it's just content editors, and then the static server you can throw, especially if you throw something like Varnish in front of it or on Netlify, like it's dirt cheap to serve that kind of stuff. Absolutely, it's a good point.
So I can help us wrap up, because I had this question I was going to ask you, Martin, directly, but I think we've all batted it around. So for all of us, it's like, where do we see the overall future of content management systems? I'm calling it content management system because that's the broad term of Drupal headless, how we're going to build our websites, or I think the proper term to align with trees is to build our experiences that we're creating on the web, because it's not about websites anymore. And Drupal's trying to fit into that. It's not a CMS, but I think that helps marketer. I don't know. CMS is a good old term. So Nick, you go first.
I'll jump in first. I don't think Drupal's going anywhere, right? I mean, if it does, I'll be very sad. But I think that a couple of things that CMSs do, especially Drupal, that are more painful in a React world are things like the actual content entry. Like that whole system has to be built up. If you're purely a React site, the databaseification of the content, right? Normalizing all that stuff. React by default uses like MongoDB, which is a NoSQL, like normalizing that, getting the data clean. Like you end up having to, you have to do a little bit of this even if you're using Drupal as the backend, but especially if you're using Mongo or DynamoDB as your backend, like every time you call the data, you have to be like, well, does this data actually exist? Is it in the right format? Is it, because you can put whatever you want into it, like, and that's something that Drupal, like sanitizing the data, making sure it's valid, that kind of stuff. Drupal does great out of the box. The other thing that Drupal does that is difficult in those situations, translation, user management, role management, all that kind of stuff. Drupal kind of just we sometimes take for granted, and I've built those systems before. It is difficult. It is painful. Like, especially when you're getting to like the granularity of the permissions that many times we get with Drupal. Like you can give people not just CRUD level permissions for content, but ownership CRUD level permissions. Or with a few modules, you can say like this person can edit this field, but not this field.
Yeah, the collaboration.
Those kinds of things are difficult, and not difficult. Maybe not difficult, but take a lot of time if you're going to do them correctly in a headless situation. And Drupal excels at that kind of stuff. So I don't think it's going anywhere.
I'll go next, because I mean, what I want to summarize what you said and kind of echo, like, I think content authoring is going to be one of the biggest things people are going to double down on, because that's what is important. If we want to create rich user experience, we have to have good content and make it easier for someone to author it. Even omni-channel, like I always am thrown off, like when you're in Drupal's admin, you're authoring content to think of it displayed on a page, but rarely do you think of how it will be displayed on voice or read out loud on Alexa, and how we get those previews working. And then I hadn't thought about it, but when you bring up permissions, workflow, roles, that's all content administration. And those two sides, I think Drupal is going to keep excelling and focusing on that. We're going to have to double down on the authoring experience and improve it even more. I do think Drupal's got the best authoring experience in the CMS market because of the flexibility. Because you can't, it's not one size fits all for building relationships. It just depends on the scale. And Drupal offers 4 different ways to be like, oh, here's related people. Here's inline entity references to people. Here's paragraphs if you really want to do it that. Like, there's just so many different ways to provide an experience. I see that as a very important thing. And the only other thing that I've hinted at is I really see CMS is needing to become ridiculously stable in the back end, as like future-proofed. You're going to build a CMS backend and that's it. Your organization is going to stay on it, and they're just going to evolve the architecture and never either. Maybe they re-platform. That would be, they would never do an upgrade. It would be about a strategy to keep it evolving. So that there's my add-on.
I can go next. John, if you don't mind.
You want to do the wrap-up, John?
Sure.
Saving the best for last.
So I don't know about that. But
if you look at the analysts like Gartner or Forrester, they've actually dropped web CMS as a category that they analyze, because according to them, it's basically become a commodity. So you think about, it used to be that it was sort of, Drupal and WordPress and Plone and a couple of these other ones. But now with sort of, the Wix and the Squarespaces and a variety of other sort of, SaaS and CAS type options, there really is a lot more in terms of, just options available. And so I think it's interesting that Drupal, I feel like, is coming back in a way to sort of how it used to be a bit more when I started using Drupal, where a lot of the modules were not so much around being kind of like developer toolkits as really being more sort of full-fledged solutions. So it used to be that there was like a job search module that was the whole job system, and it was, had a bunch of sort of functionality basically baked into it. And so as a site owner, if you needed that, you installed this module and it was basically ready to go. And I feel like recipes is moving us back in that direction. I think even things like schema.org blueprints makes it easier for people to sort of add these sort of sections to their website without sort of having to have as much Drupal expertise. So I'm hopeful that by making it easier for site owners, you think about Project Browser now to, add some of these things as a solution, go into the UI, they can quickly build out their website and have something that's more than just, going through and configuring sort of individually piece by piece. You can really sort of rough out potentially a fairly robust application in a short amount of time without having to have a lot of technical expertise. And so I think that's definitely an area that I find exciting about the direction Drupal is moving in right now.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think you all have hit on the benefits, and I technically I think I agree with everybody. I will say that we've been highlighting it throughout this show. And one thing that I want to add is that, you can choose, as Jacob said, you can choose. There are, SaaS solutions out there, Contentful, Squarespace. As we've been highlighting through this show, it depends what problem you're trying to solve, what solution is going to work best for you. I think where Drupal excels above a lot of these solutions, and to be quite frank, I think that Jacob said it earlier, where Drupal helps industry, helps corporations, and is it can be considered a corporate CMS, is this flexibility. Every client that I've ever worked with, especially if a marketing team is involved or a site owner is involved, or multiple brands or units are involved, flexibility has been a huge a huge factor in their decision-making process, right? And I think Drupal has the most amount of flexibility because, as we all know, we can do anything with Drupal. I like to tell our clients, like, we can do anything with Drupal with enough time and money, right? Yeah. And I think overall, I don't know specific cost structures of some of the SaaS solutions, but I think, they get you pretty close to what you need, right? But they're not as flexible in content architecture, content modeling, right? They're not as flexible in the ability to pull a module off the shelf and have an integration or a feature ready to use. Or the customizations, because again, when you think of corporate entities, they still have legacy systems they have to integrate. They still have specific internal systems that they have to integrate with. So, I think overall, when you're looking at when you're looking at Drupal, it may not necessarily be the cheapest option up front, right? But I think in the long term, especially going back to that model of not having to do major upgrades every year now, being able to feature enhance and to improve as you go, right? You're looking at a much cheaper year over year solution, a much more flexible year over year solution, and really, the solution that's probably going to support your organization for the long term. So yes, I agree with all of you. And, I think that, clearly I'm a Drupal fanboy. So maybe my opinion is a little bit biased, but based on what I've seen, I think that the flexibility and the customization is key and what people are really looking for. Because the second you go to a SaaS option, and that SaaS option doesn't do that one thing that the marketing team needs it to do, or that one thing that a C-level employee needs it to do, like, that solution is dead to them. That solution is not solving the problem, right?
Yeah, and the cost scaling too is another thing. Like Jacob said, many times, like, it's kind of twofold too. Like, a lot of these SaaS solutions is like per user. So if you have a large organization that has 500 users that need to be able to edit content, well, I mean, yeah, there's going to be added cost of Drupal too, because if you have 500 people editing content, you need bigger servers, right? Than you do if you have 5 editors. But it's not going to be $50 a month per user,
right?
And same thing for a lot of these SaaS companies will charge you by traffic, right? And if you have a bump in traffic, it's like, well, now our bill just went up by $50,000 this month. Whereas Drupal, again, if traffic goes up, you might need bigger servers, but that scale is, even if you're adding a couple of servers.
I don't know. I think Drupal's caching layer and the ability to add something like Cloudflare in front of it can help with that. But I feel like our next Fact or Fiction show is going to be SaaS Fact or Fiction.
SaaS is here to stay.
I think we just circled around. Like, Drupals are real for enterprise stuff. It's really a good thing to have in your infrastructure. It's like, if you expect to be building sites that are large, to have this in your toolbox. And Martin, I think the whole question is deciding the right way to use it. It's a tool. It's not a hammer. It's a set of tools, and you got to figure out the right way to use it in your infrastructure and evolve it. I also think, Martin, one thing we didn't say is, like, you should use it, maybe not go headless, but keep thinking about it. Keep monitoring every project you get. You have to almost assess, would this benefit from a React front end?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to it's the glue or the traffic cop in a lot of organizations, right? Like, you can it's the Swiss Army knife of backends, if you will.
Yeah.
Martin, as always, it was a pleasure having you, and it was a very insightful and enlightening conversation. So thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here.
Do you have questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email or show@talkingdrupal.com. You can also connect with our hosts and other listeners on the Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel. And if you have suggestions for guests or topics, we take those to heart as well.
Just like Nerd Summit did today, you can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
You can get the Talking Drupal newsletter for show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more by signing up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button in the sidebar. All right, as we bring this show in for a landing, Martin, if folks wanted to reach out to you to debate Headless or talk about many of the modules that you have or anything else for that matter, how would they go about doing that?
So they can find me on all the major social channels as Manclue, or they can read blog posts like the one that inspired our discussion today at manclue.com.
And we will have a link to that blog post in the show notes for easy clicking. Jacob, thank you for joining us for the second week. If folks wanted to contact you, how could they go about doing that?
I think it's very similar to Martin in that you can reach me at jrockowitz.com and Twitter and on Drupal Slack and Drupal.org, all using the same handle.
And Nick, what about you?
You can find me online pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks as well as Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.